The mourners gathered under a relentless grey sky, their black attire stark against the vibrant flowers surrounding the casket. Victor Thompson had been a pillar of the community, a successful businessman whose charitable foundation had touched countless lives. His death had shocked everyone. A sudden heart attack while alone in his study had robbed the world of a seemingly kind and generous man. His daughter Zoe stood at the graveside, her elegant features frozen in a mask of composure that concealed the turmoil beneath. She clutched a handkerchief in one hand, while the other rested on the ornate wooden cage beside her. Inside, Sebastian, her father's beloved African grey parrot, shifted restlessly, his intelligent eyes taking in the somber gathering. The family had debated whether to bring Sebastian to the funeral, but Zoe had insisted. Dad loved him more than anything, she'd argued. Sebastian was with him every day for years. He deserves to say goodbye too. What no one expected was for Sebastian to break the reverent silence of the ceremony. As the priest's solemn words drifted across the gathering, Sebastian suddenly erupted with a piercing squawk that made several mourners jump. His wings flapped against the bars of his cage as he fixed his gaze on the casket. "Take her out of there!" the parrot shrieked, his voice a perfect imitation of Victor's commanding tone. "Take her out! She's alive! Take her out of there!" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Zoe's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to shush the bird. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to those nearby. "He's upset. He doesn't understand what's happening." But Sebastian continued his frantic calls. "Take her out! Penelope! Take her out of there!" The mention of Penelope sent a visible shock through the gathering. Penelope Martinez had been Victor's wife, Zoe's mother, who had vanished without a trace years ago. The official story was that she had abandoned her family, running away with an unnamed lover. Victor had never spoken of her again, and over time, even Zoe had stopped asking questions. William, Victor's business partner and closest friend, stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Perhaps you should take Sebastian home," he suggested quietly. "This is difficult for everyone." But Miranda, Victor's sister, who had flown in from across the country for the funeral, was staring at the parrot with an odd expression. "Who is he talking about?" she asked, her voice cutting through the awkward murmurs. "Why would he say that name after all this time?" "It's nothing," William interjected quickly. "Birds repeat things without understanding. Victor probably mentioned his ex-wife at some point, and Sebastian is just—" "Take her out!" Sebastian screeched again, more insistently. "She's under the study. Take her out." The funeral director approached, clearly uncomfortable. "Ms. Thompson, perhaps it would be best if—" But Zoe wasn't listening anymore. A cold realization was dawning on her face as she stared at the bird. Sebastian had been Victor's constant companion for years, perched in his study during business calls, meetings, and private moments. The parrot had heard everything. "Sebastian never met my mother," she said slowly, her voice barely audible. "She was gone before Dad got him." A heavy silence fell over the gathering. Xavier, the family lawyer who had been standing quietly at the back, stepped forward. "Zoe, this is hardly the time or place to—" "What's under the study, William?" Zoe interrupted, turning to her father's friend with sudden intensity. "Why would Sebastian say that?" William's face had gone pale. "I'm sure it's nothing. Victor renovated that house multiple times. Perhaps there was talk of construction, foundations." "She's under the study," Sebastian repeated, rocking back and forth. "He put her there. Take her out." The funeral ground to a halt as police were called. What had begun as a somber farewell had transformed into the beginning of a disturbing investigation. While most of the shocked mourners were asked to leave, Zoe found herself sitting in a police car, Sebastian's cage beside her, as officers obtained an emergency warrant to search Victor Thompson's lavish home. Detective Julia Reeves had been assigned to the case, her experienced eyes watching Zoe carefully as they pulled up to the Thompson estate. "Birds can be remarkably intelligent," she noted, glancing at Sebastian. "African greys in particular are known for their ability to not just mimic, but sometimes understand context." "My father adored Sebastian," Zoe replied numbly. "He was always talking to him, even when they were alone. Said it helped him think through problems." "And your mother disappeared. When exactly?" Zoe swallowed hard. "I was young. We never discussed it much." Dad said she'd left us for someone else, that she didn't want to be found. Eventually, I stopped asking. Julia nodded, making a note. And there was never any investigation? No missing persons report? Dad handled everything, Zoe said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. He showed me a letter she'd written saying she needed a fresh start. Why would I question that? They entered the house, a magnificent colonial with sprawling grounds and a view of the lake. Sebastian grew increasingly agitated as they approached Victor's study, a wood-paneled room filled with leather-bound books and expensive art. "He put her there," the Parrot called out, "under the floor." The forensics team arrived and began a methodical examination of the study. It didn't take long to discover that a section of the hardwood flooring had been replaced at some point. The stain was slightly different, the boards newer than those surrounding them. As they carefully removed the section of flooring, the acrid smell of decay mixed with chemicals rose from the dark space beneath. Detective Julia covered her nose and mouth while directing the crime scene technicians. "We've got something," one of them called up after shining a light into the cavity. "Looks like some kind of container, sealed." What they eventually extracted was a large, airtight storage container, the kind used for preserving valuable items. When they finally opened it, wearing protective gear and masks, the contents confirmed their worst fears. Inside, wrapped carefully in plastic, were human remains. Zoe collapsed into a chair, her face ashen as the reality hit her. Sebastian had fallen silent, watching the proceedings with his head tilted to one side. "I need to get a forensics team in here," Julia said quietly to her partner, "and we'll need dental records to confirm, but—" "It's her, isn't it?" Zoe whispered. "It's my mother." Julia couldn't answer that yet, but the grim set of her mouth told Zoe everything she needed to know. Her father, the man the community had gathered to mourn just hours before, was not who anyone thought he was. As the police cordoned off the study and began a thorough investigation of the entire property, Zoe sat in the kitchen with Sebastian's cage beside her, trying to process the unthinkable. Her entire life had been built on a lie. The father she had loved and respected was potentially a murderer who had hidden his crime in plain sight for years. Miranda joined her, placing a cup of tea on the table with shaking hands. "I always had my suspicions," she admitted quietly. "Victor changed after Penelope disappeared, became more controlled, more perfect, like he was playing a role." "Why didn't you say anything?" Zoe demanded, anger flaring through her shock. "What could I say? That I thought my brother might have done something terrible, based on nothing but a feeling." Miranda's eyes filled with tears. "I told myself I was being paranoid. That grief affects people in different ways. I wanted to believe him, Zoe." Zoe looked at Sebastian, who was now preening his feathers, as if nothing unusual had happened. "All this time," she murmured, "he knew. He heard everything." "Birds don't understand death or murder," Miranda said. "He was just repeating what he heard. Your father must have talked about it when he thought no one was listening." The thought of her father speaking to the Parrot about her mother's body hidden beneath the floorboards sent a chill through Zoe. What kind of man had Victor Thompson really been? What other secrets might he have kept? As the initial shock began to wear off, questions multiplied. If Victor had killed Penelope, why? What had happened that night, and why had he kept Sebastian, a living witness to his crime all these years? Detective Julia returned to the kitchen, her face grave. "Ms. Thompson, I need to ask you some questions about your father's business dealings and personal relationships. Anything that might help us understand what happened." Zoe nodded numbly. "Of course. Whatever you need." "Also," Julia continued, glancing at Sebastian, "if it's all right with you, we'd like to record the Parrot. Sometimes these birds retain phrases or conversations that could be relevant to our investigation." "He's evidence now," Zoe said flatly, looking at the creature who had been her father's constant companion, "the only witness to whatever happened to my mother." As the day wore on and the investigation intensified, Zoe found herself viewing her childhood home with new eyes. Every room, every memento now seemed tainted. Had her father been thinking about the secret beneath his feet each time he sat in that study? Had he felt any remorse as he watched his daughter grow up without her mother? William returned later that evening, his usual confidence shattered. The news had spread quickly through their close-knit community, and already the narrative of Victor Thompson's life was being rewritten. "I can't believe it," he said, collapsing into a chair across from Zoe. "I've known your father for decades. We've worked together, traveled together. I would have staked my life that he was a good man." "Apparently we didn't know him at all," Zoe replied, her voice hollow. Sebastian, who had been quiet for hours, suddenly perked up at William's voice. "Tell her nothing," the parrot said clearly in Victor's distinctive tone. "William knows nothing." The kitchen fell silent as all eyes turned to the bird, then to William, whose face had drained of color. "What does he mean by that, William?" Zoe asked slowly. Before he could answer, Detective Julia stepped back into the room, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, addressing William formally, "I think we need to continue this conversation at the station." As William was escorted out, Zoe was left alone with Sebastian and the ruins of her family legacy. The parrot's revelations had torn open a wound long concealed, but they had only scratched the surface of the truth. What role had William played in all this? What else might Sebastian reveal as the investigation continued? And most disturbingly, if her father had been capable of murdering her mother and living with that secret for years, what other dark truths might be buried within the walls of the Thompson estate? The answers would prove far more complex and devastating than Zoe could possibly imagine, stretching back through decades of carefully constructed deception and threatening to unravel not just her family history, but the foundations of the entire community her father had helped build. The days following the funeral blurred together for Zoe. The Thompson estate, once a symbol of privilege and success, had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the study where her mother's remains had been discovered, and forensic teams meticulously documented every inch of the property. Sebastian's cage had been moved to Zoe's apartment across town, a decision that filled her with conflicting emotions. The parrot was both a connection to her father and the key witness to his darkest deed. Each time Sebastian spoke in Victor's voice, Zoe felt a chill run through her. "The dental records confirmed it," Detective Julia said gently, sitting across from Zoe in her living room. "The remains belong to your mother, Penelope Martinez. Based on our preliminary findings, she's been dead since she disappeared." Zoe nodded, numb to the confirmation of what she had already accepted. "And the cause of death?" Julia hesitated. "Blunt force trauma to the head. There were signs of a struggle. We found trace evidence in the master bedroom that suggests that's where it happened. So he killed her upstairs and then hid her body under his study floor." Zoe's voice was flat, emotionless. "Where he would walk over her every day for years." From his perch, Sebastian watched the conversation with his head tilted. "She was going to take everything," he suddenly announced in Victor's voice. "Everything I built." Both women turned to the parrot, startled by the outburst. "Your father's speech patterns are remarkably preserved in Sebastian's memory," Julia noted, reaching for her notebook. "Has he said anything else like this since you brought him home?" Zoe nodded slowly. "Little things, phrases that sound like Dad talking to himself." She hesitated. "Last night he kept repeating, 'William has the files. William knows where they are.'" "That matches what we're finding in our investigation of William Reynolds," Julia replied. "We executed a search warrant on his home yesterday. He had a hidden safe containing documents related to your father's business, financial records that had been deliberately kept separate from the company books." "What kind of records?" "Evidence of significant funds being moved through offshore accounts. We're still tracing it all, but it appears your father was involved in some questionable financial dealings. William was clearly helping him manage these shadow transactions." Sebastian fluttered his wings and moved closer to the edge of his perch. "Penelope found the ledger," he squawked. "She's going to ruin everything." The realization hit Zoe like a physical blow. "She discovered what he was doing," she whispered. "That's why he killed her. Not a crime of passion or a relationship gone wrong. It was about money." "It seems likely," Julia agreed. "We've been interviewing people who knew your parents back then. Several mentioned that your mother had become concerned about Victor's business practices shortly before she disappeared. Zoe stood and paced the room, her mind racing. So my father was corrupt, possibly criminal. My mother found out and threatened to expose him. He killed her, hid her body, and then invented a story about her abandoning us. She laughed bitterly. And then he spent the rest of his life building his reputation as a philanthropist and community leader. A perfect cover, Julia observed. No one questions the ethics of someone who donates millions to local charities. Did William help him? Zoe asked. With my mother, I mean. He claims he only found out about your mother's death years afterward, when the financial deception was too deep for him to walk away from. He insists he never knew where Victor had hidden her body. Julia's expression remained neutral. We're still investigating the extent of his involvement. Sebastian suddenly began pacing his perch agitatedly. Check the boathouse, he said clearly. Check the boathouse ledger. Julia immediately made a note. We haven't thoroughly searched the boathouse yet. Is there one on the property? On the lake, Zoe confirmed. Dad kept a small sailboat there. We rarely used it after she disappeared. A forensic team was dispatched to the boathouse within the hour. What they found hidden within a weathered beam under the dock was a waterproof case containing a worn leather ledger, filled with handwritten notes detailing years of financial transactions, bribes, and blackmail. The evidence painted a damning picture. Victor Thompson had built his fortune not through legitimate business acumen, but through an intricate web of corruption. He had blackmailed competitors, bribed officials, and laundered money for local criminals. The ledger contained names of prominent figures throughout the community, people who had either been victims of Victor's schemes or willing participants. Your mother must have discovered this, Julia explained when she returned to Zoe's apartment. Based on the dates, it corresponds with the time right before she disappeared. Zoe flipped through page after page of her father's careful handwriting, documenting his crimes with meticulous precision. He was so careful about everything, she murmured. Even his criminal activities were perfectly organized. Sebastian, who had been watching from his perch, suddenly spoke again. She doesn't understand what it takes, he said in Victor's voice. I did what was necessary. He was justifying it to himself, Zoe realized. All those hours alone in his study, talking to Sebastian, he was rehearsing his excuses. Julia nodded. People who commit these kinds of crimes often create narratives that cast themselves as the hero of their own story. Your father may have convinced himself that his ends justified his means. And what about my mother? How did he justify that? Julia had no answer, but Sebastian did. She gave me no choice, the parrot said flatly. She would have destroyed everything. The investigation expanded rapidly after the discovery of the ledger. Multiple financial crimes were uncovered as authorities dug deeper into the Thompson empire. William Reynolds, facing serious charges himself, began cooperating with prosecutors, hoping for leniency. As the days passed, Zoe found herself spending more time observing Sebastian. The parrot had been privy to her father's most private moments, both mundane and monstrous. He was a living archive of Victor's confessions, rationalizations, and secrets. I wonder what else you know, she said softly one evening, watching Sebastian methodically clean his feathers. How much of my father's true self did you witness? As if in answer, Sebastian stopped his preening and fixed her with his intelligent gaze. Tell Zoe I did it for her, he said in Victor's gentle tone, the voice he had used only with his daughter. She'll have a better life. Tears sprang to Zoe's eyes. Even in his private moments, Victor had been constructing justifications, casting his crimes as sacrifices made for his daughter's benefit. He was wrong, she whispered to the bird. Nothing was worth what he did. Nothing. The next morning, Zoe walked into the police station with Sebastian's cage and a determined expression. Detective Julia looked up from her desk, surprised. I've been thinking, Zoe said without preamble. Sebastian is the key witness in this case. He should be somewhere he can help the investigation, not locked in my apartment with just me to hear him. Julia nodded thoughtfully. We can set up a monitored environment where specialists can work with him, try to document everything he remembers. I want to be involved, Zoe insisted. "He knows me, trusts me, and I need to hear the truth, all of it." "Are you sure?" Julia asked gently. "What he reveals might be difficult to hear." Zoe's gaze was unwavering. "My entire life has been built on lies. I can't move forward without facing the truth, no matter how painful." The arrangement was made. Sebastian would stay in a comfortable, specially designed room at the station with recording equipment running at all times. Zoe would visit daily, working with animal behavior experts to encourage the parrot to share more of what he had witnessed. What emerged over the following weeks was a chilling narrative, fragments of conversations, arguments, and private confessions that, when pieced together, revealed the full extent of Victor Thompson's corruption and the calculated murder of his wife. "She found the ledger Thursday," Sebastian recounted in Victor's voice. "Says she's going to the authorities. William says we need to handle this carefully. No one can ever know. Zoe can never know." Each revelation was another blow, another thread unraveled from the fabric of Zoe's understanding of her life. But with each painful truth came a strange sort of clarity. The mysteries that had shadowed her childhood, her father's transformations from affectionate to cold, her fractured memories of her mother, the inexplicable rules that had governed their household, all began to make terrible sense. Miranda, who had remained in town throughout the investigation, provided another piece of the puzzle when she shared her own suspicions from years ago. "Victor changed overnight after Penelope disappeared," she explained to Zoe over coffee. "He became obsessed with controlling his image, with being seen as a pillar of the community. It was like he was building a fortress of respectability around himself. A shield against suspicion," Zoe realized. "Exactly. And he isolated you, private schools, limited contact with your mother's family, carefully selected friends. I thought at the time he was being overprotective after losing his wife, but now we know he was making sure I never heard anything that might contradict his story." As the case against William and Victor's former associates built, Zoe made a difficult decision. The Thompson fortune, her inheritance, was tainted by her father's crimes. After consulting with ethical financial advisors, she established a foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud and domestic violence. "I can't undo what he did," she told Julia, "but I can try to create something good from it." Sebastian, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in legal circles, the unprecedented witness whose testimony was helping to solve a decades-old murder and unravel a complex web of financial crimes. Animal behavior experts studied his remarkable memory and contextual understanding, amazed by the parrot's ability to retain and reproduce specific conversations from years past. For Zoe, however, Sebastian was something more personal, a bridge between the father she had known and the man he truly was. The parrot had seen Victor at his worst moments and his most vulnerable. He had been both accomplice and witness to years of secret guilt. One evening, as Zoe sat with Sebastian after a long day of recorded testimony, the parrot fixed her with his penetrating gaze and spoke in a voice she had almost forgotten, her mother's. "My beautiful Zoe," he said softly, "be brave, my love." Zoe froze, tears springing to her eyes. You remember her voice?" Sebastian bobbed his head, his feathers ruffling slightly. "Be brave, my love," he repeated, then switched to Victor's voice. "She'll never know the truth." But he had been wrong. Thanks to Sebastian, Zoe did know the truth, a truth that had remained hidden for years before finally being exposed in the most unexpected way. As she gently stroked Sebastian's feathers, Zoe realized that the parrot had given her something her father never had: honesty. With that painful gift came the chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of truth rather than deception. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be trials, both literal and emotional. The community was still reeling from the revelations about Victor Thompson and his associates. But for the first time since the funeral that had changed everything, Zoe felt a sense of possibility, a chance to define herself not by her father's legacy, but by her own choices. And Sebastian, the unlikely hero whose simple words had cracked open decades of deception, would be beside her every step of the way, a constant reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its voice. The trial of William Reynolds became the focal point of public attention in the months that followed. The courtroom was packed daily as the prosecution built their case using evidence from the ledger, financial records, and, most unusually, transcripts of Sebastian's recorded testimony. Though the Parrot couldn't take the stand in any official capacity, the recordings of his perfect mimicry of Victor's voice, recounting incriminating details, had provided investigators with crucial leads. Legal experts debated the precedent, but the evidence Sebastian had helped uncover was indisputable. William, facing decades in prison, had eventually offered a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony filled in the final gaps in the narrative of Penelope's murder. "Victor called me that night in a panic," he'd admitted on the stand, his eyes downcast. "Said there had been an accident, that Penelope had threatened to expose everything. When I arrived at the house, she was already dead." According to William, he had helped Victor clean up the evidence and advised him on creating the story of abandonment, but he claimed he hadn't known where Victor had hidden the body until years later. "He told me one night after too many drinks," William testified, said it gave him a sense of power, having her beneath his feet while he built his reputation above. "I was too deep in the conspiracy by then to back out." The courtroom had fallen silent at this revelation, the calculated cruelty of Victor's choice of hiding place revealing a darkness far beyond what anyone had imagined. For Zoe, sitting through the trial was both excruciating and cathartic. Each day brought new revelations about her father's criminal activities, the competitors he had systematically destroyed, the officials he had compromised, the records he had falsified. The philanthropic image he had so carefully constructed now appeared as it truly was, a calculated attempt to launder not just money, but his own reputation. Yet amid the painful revelations, unexpected connections emerged. Nancy Foster, a quiet woman who had worked as Victor's assistant for years, approached Zoe during a recess. "Your mother was my friend," she said simply. "I never believed she would abandon you." "Did you suspect what happened to her?" Zoe asked. Nancy shook her head. "Not exactly, but I noticed how Victor changed afterward, more controlling, more image-conscious, and he got rid of certain items from your mother's office so quickly." She hesitated. "I kept something of hers. I always thought someday I might give it to you when you were older. I just never found the right moment." The item turned out to be Penelope's personal journal, a small leather-bound book that Victor had ordered Nancy to destroy, along with other personal effects. Nancy had secretly preserved it, unable to part with this last piece of her friend. In the privacy of her apartment that evening, Zoe opened the journal with trembling hands. Sebastian watched from his perch, unusually quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The journal painted a vivid picture of Penelope Martinez, vibrant, principled, and increasingly concerned about her husband's business activities. The final entries detailed her discovery of financial irregularities and her growing fear of Victor's reaction. "He becomes someone else when challenged," the last entry read. "There's a coldness that comes over him. I'm afraid of what might happen, but I can't be complicit in this. For Zoe's sake, there must be truth and accountability in our home." Tears streamed down Zoe's face as she read her mother's final thoughts, her determination to do the right thing, even knowing the risks. Sebastian flew from his perch to the back of Zoe's chair, making a soft sound unlike any she had heard from him before. "She loved you," the Parrot said, not in Victor's voice or even Penelope's, but in his own distinctive tone, as if offering his own observation rather than a mimicked phrase. The journal became a crucial piece of evidence in the ongoing trials against Victor's former associates. More importantly for Zoe, it provided a connection to the mother she had lost, not the abandoning figure from her father's fiction, but a woman of integrity who had stood against corruption at the cost of her life. As William's trial concluded with a guilty verdict, Julia visited Zoe with news about another aspect of the investigation. "We've identified several offshore accounts linked to your father," the detective explained. "One contains funds that we believe were intended as a contingency plan, a significant amount set aside under an alias." "More of his hidden money," Zoe said with a weary sigh. "Yes, but there's something unusual about this account. It was created right after your mother's disappearance, but the beneficiary isn't Victor or any of his known associates. Julia handed Zoe a document. It's you. Specifically, it becomes accessible to you upon Victor's death. Zoe stared at the paperwork in confusion. Why would he set aside money for me separately from his regular estate? There's more, Julia continued. The account has unusual stipulations. It can only be accessed in person with specific identification requirements, and it's housed in a private banking institution known for its discretion. What are you suggesting? I think this wasn't just money. I think there might be something else in that account, something Victor wanted you to find after he was gone. The possibility haunted Zoe. Had her father left her some kind of message from beyond the grave? A confession? An explanation? After consulting with her lawyers, she made arrangements to visit the banking institution. The private bank was housed in an elegant building in a financial district several hours away. Zoe was escorted to a secure room where she presented the required identification and documentation. The bank manager returned with a safety deposit box. This was established by the account holder to be delivered to you upon the triggering conditions, he explained formally. Our institution guarantees absolute privacy in these matters. Left alone with the box, Zoe hesitated before opening it. Sebastian had accompanied her on this journey, his cage now sitting on a chair beside her. The parrot watched with his characteristic intense focus as she finally lifted the lid. Inside was an envelope addressed to her in her father's handwriting, along with a USB drive and a small photograph. Zoe, as a child, sitting on her mother's lap, both smiling at the camera. With shaking hands, she opened the letter. Zoe, it began, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have likely discovered the truth about your mother. I have rehearsed these words countless times, speaking them aloud only to Sebastian, trying to find the right way to confess my unforgivable actions. The letter continued, detailing the events of that terrible night. The argument when Penelope had confronted him with evidence of his financial crimes, his explosive anger, the fatal blow that had ended her life. Victor described his elaborate cover-up and the years of deception that followed. I tell myself I did it all for you, he wrote, that I was protecting your future, your inheritance, your place in society. But in my most honest moments, I know the truth. I did it to protect myself, my reputation, my freedom. I have lived with this knowledge every day, walking above her resting place, speaking to a bird who heard my every confession, but could never judge me as I deserved to be judged. The USB drive contained video recordings, Victor sitting alone in his study, speaking directly to the camera. In each recording, dated at yearly intervals, he detailed his crimes and expressed his conflicted feelings about what he had done. It was a video diary of a murderer living with his guilt, sometimes justifying his actions, other times expressing deep remorse. These recordings are my testimony, the letter concluded. Use them as you see fit. The accounts detailed in the accompanying documents contain funds that rightfully belong to those I wronged over the years. I leave it to you to decide how to distribute this restitution. I cannot ask for forgiveness. What I did is unforgivable, but I can at least offer you the truth, which is something I denied you throughout your life. Your mother was everything I claimed to be, honest, principled, and brave. Remember her, not me. Zoe sat in silence for a long time after reading the letter, watching the bank's ornate clock tick forward. Sebastian remained unusually still, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. He knew, she finally said to the parrot, he knew that someday, somehow, the truth would come out, and he prepared for it. Sebastian tilted his head, his intelligent eyes fixed on Zoe. Truth comes out, he said softly, a new phrase he seemed to have created from his vocabulary. The materials from the safety deposit box provided the final pieces of evidence needed to fully unravel Victor Thompson's criminal network. The video confessions, combined with the detailed financial information, led to numerous additional charges against his former associates and reparations for many who had been victimized by his schemes. For Zoe, the discovery brought a complex mixture of emotions. Her father had been a murderer and a criminal, but in his final act he had chosen to provide a path toward justice, however belated. It didn't redeem him, but it offered a small measure of atonement. In the year that followed, Zoe worked tirelessly through her foundation to distribute the recovered funds to those her father had wronged. She established a scholarship in her mother's name for students pursuing careers in ethical business practices and financial oversight. The Thompson estate was sold, the proceeds going to victims' compensation funds. As for Sebastian, the parrot who had cracked open decades of deception with a few simple phrases at a funeral, he remained with Zoe. They had formed an unusual bond through their shared experiences, both victims of Victor's deception, both instruments in revealing the truth. The media eventually lost interest in the story as newer scandals emerged, but Sebastian's role had sparked important conversations about animal cognition and the unexpected ways that truth can surface. Research institutions had offered substantial sums to study the remarkably intelligent parrot, but Zoe declined. Sebastian had spent enough of his life as an unwitting witness to human darkness. Instead, she created a sunny room in her new home overlooking a garden, where Sebastian could live out his days in peace, free from the burden of secrets. Julia, who had remained a friend long after the investigation concluded, often visited, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought justice after so many years. "Do you ever wonder why your father kept Sebastian all those years?" she asked Zoe during one such visit. "He must have known the risk of keeping a witness who might repeat what he'd heard." Zoe watched the parrot preening contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "I think he needed a confessor," she replied, "someone he could speak honestly to without consequences. He probably never imagined Sebastian would eventually be understood." "A conscience he could cage," Julia observed. "Yes, but even the most carefully constructed cages eventually fail." Zoe smiled sadly. "In the end, I think a part of him wanted to be exposed. Why else leave those recordings, that letter? Some truths demand to be spoken, even if it takes a parrot to speak them." On the anniversary of her mother's proper burial, a small, dignified ceremony that had given Penelope the respect denied her for so long, Zoe visited the grave with a bouquet of her mother's favorite flowers. Sebastian accompanied her, riding on her shoulder rather than in his cage. As Zoe knelt to place the flowers, Sebastian spoke softly in her ear, using Penelope's voice one final time. "Be brave, my love." And she was. Brave enough to face the truth, however painful. Brave enough to use her father's ill-gotten wealth to make amends to those he had wronged. Brave enough to rebuild her life on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. The parrot who had shocked mourners at a funeral with his urgent cries had set in motion a cascade of revelations that had transformed not just Zoe's understanding of her past, but her vision for her future. What had begun with a bird's desperate warning had ended with justice, truth, and the possibility of healing. Sebastian, perched on Zoe's shoulder in the gentle afternoon sun, fell silent, his role as truth-teller complete, his unlikely mission accomplished. Some secrets refuse to stay buried forever, finding their voice in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes it takes a parrot shouting from a cage to teach humans the value of speaking truth, no matter how long delayed. As they turned to leave the cemetery, Zoe felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since that fateful funeral day. The truth, once revealed, had set them all free, Sebastian from his role as unwitting confidant, her mother from her unmarked grave beneath the study floor, and Zoe herself from the web of lies that had entangled her life for as long as she could remember. "Let's go home," she said to Sebastian. The parrot bobbed his head in agreement, his feathers catching the light as they walked together toward whatever the future might hold, no longer haunted by the shadows of secrets untold. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.